The morning of May 19th, 1536, marks one of the most shocking judicial murders in English history. What we're about to examine reveals a level of calculated cruelty that surpasses common understanding of Anne Boleyn's execution. The evidence shows this wasn't merely a beheading, it was psychological warfare, character assassination, and the systematic destruction of a woman who stood in the way of a king's desires. Let's begin with a chilling detail often overlooked by historians. As Anne Boleyn awaited execution in her Tower apartments, she could hear the construction of her own scaffold. Workers hammered and sawed outside her window, assembling the platform where she would die. Each sound was a countdown. This wasn't accidental. In Tudor England, every aspect of execution was carefully orchestrated for maximum psychological impact. To understand how England's crowned queen ended up on a scaffold, we must examine the extraordinary rise of the Boleyn family. Anne was born around 1501 to Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious diplomat who strategically placed his children in royal circles. Her sister Mary had already become King Henry VIII's mistress, but Anne employed a different strategy entirely. When Henry VIII turned his attention to Anne around 1526, she made an unprecedented decision. She refused to become his mistress. She held out for marriage and the crown. Remarkably, she succeeded where no one thought possible. The obstacle was substantial. Henry had been married to Catherine of Aragon for over 2 decades. Catherine had borne him one surviving child, Princess Mary, but no male heir. By the late 1560s, Henry convinced himself his marriage was cursed by God because Catherine had previously been married to his deceased brother Arthur. He sought an annulment from Rome. Pope Clement VII refused. Henry's response reshaped English history. Between 1532 and 1534, he broke England away from the Roman Catholic Church, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and dissolved his marriage to Catherine. This wasn't simply about love. It was about dynasty, power, and male succession. But Anne was the catalyst. They married secretly in January 15th, 1533. Anne was already pregnant. On September 7th, 1533, she gave birth to Elizabeth, not the longed-for son, but a daughter who would eventually become one of England's greatest monarchs. In 1533, however, her birth represented disappointment. Anne was nevertheless crowned queen on June 1st, 1533, with full traditional ceremony at Westminster Abbey. As queen, she exercised considerable influence. Historical evidence shows she championed religious reform, supported Bible translation into English, and patronized scholars and reformers. She was educated, fluent in French, and politically astute, but Henry's restlessness grew. Anne suffered at least 2, possibly 3 miscarriages. The male heir remained elusive. By 1536, Henry's attention had shifted to Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. Jane represented everything Anne was not. Quiet, where Anne was vocal. Submissive, where Anne was assertive. Henry faced a problem, having already broken with Rome, and then he urged Anne to expose his crown. He needed a solution that eliminated Anne while preserving his reputation. He needed her not merely divorced, but destroyed. Enter Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, and a man of ruthless efficiency. By April 30th, 1536, Anne had become a political liability. She deposed some of Cromwell's policies and made enemies at court. Cromwell saw an opportunity. On April 30th, 1536, Cromwell arrested Mark Smeaton, a court musician of common birth. After interrogation, whose exact methods remain unknown, Smeaton confessed to adultery with Queen Anne. Historical consensus suggests this confession was obtained under duress or torture. Crucially, Smeaton was the only one of Anne's accused lovers who ever confessed. Within days, the arrests accelerated. May 1st saw the arrest of Henry Norris, groom of the stool and one of the king's closest companions. May 2nd brought the arrest of Anne herself, taken from Greenwich Palace to the Tower of London by barge. That same day, William Breton was arrested. May 4th saw Francis Weston's arrest. Most shockingly, on May 2nd, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, and Anne's own brother, was also arrested. The charges were extraordinary. Anne stood accused of adultery with 5 men, incest with her brother George, plotting the king's death, and using witchcraft to seduce Henry initially. These weren't merely scandalous accusations. In Tudor law, a queen's adultery was treason because it jeopardized the royal succession. When Anne arrived at the Tower on May 2nd, she reportedly collapsed emotionally. The Constable of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, recorded her words in letters that survive today. She asked repeatedly if she would die without justice. She protested her innocence. Then, according to Kingston, she laughed inappropriately, a sign of psychological distress under extreme pressure. Anne was held in the royal apartments within the Tower, but under constant surveillance. Her attendants were carefully selected women who reported her every word to Cromwell. Even in captivity, she had no privacy. Every protest of innocence, every moment of anguish, was documented as potential evidence. The trials proceeded with astonishing speed. On May 12th, the 5 men were tried at Westminster Hall. Mark Smeaton maintained his confession. The other 4, Norris, Brereton, Weston, and George Boleyn, proclaimed their innocence. All were convicted. Henry Norris was offered his life in exchange for confessing and implicating Anne. He refused, choosing death over false testimony. This strongly suggests there was nothing to confess. On May 15th, all 5 men were executed on Tower Hill. George Boleyn died with a speech proclaiming his innocence. He was 33 years old. Anne spent her final days knowing her brother had been killed. On May 15th, Anne herself faced trial before a jury of 27 peers in the Great Hall of the Tower. Her uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, presided as Lord High Steward. The jury included Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, Anne's former love from years before. The verdict was predetermined. Let's examine the evidence presented, because its flimsiness reveals the trial's true nature. Anne was accused of adultery on specific dates. Modern historians have demonstrated that several of these dates were impossible. On some occasions, Anne was documented at public functions with numerous witnesses. On others, she was heavily pregnant or recovering from miscarriage. One charge placed her at Westminster Palace on a date when court records prove she was at Richmond Palace, miles away. The evidence for plotting the king's death consisted of vague testimonies that Anne and her supposed lovers had discussed what might happen after Henry's death. No concrete plots were described, no weapons mentioned. The charge relied on the legal principle that even imagining the king's death constituted treason. The incest charge against Anne and George was particularly heinous. The primary evidence came from George's wife, Jane Parker, Lady Rochford, who would herself be executed 7 years later for facilitating Catherine Howard's actual adultery. Her testimony suggested Anne and George spent too much time alone together. This twisted normal sibling affection into something monstrous. Anne defended herself brilliantly. Eyewitness accounts record that she answered each charge clearly and convincingly. One observer noted that if the verdict had been based on evidence, she would have been acquitted, but evidence was irrelevant. The verdict, guilty on all counts. The sentence, death by burning or beheading at the king's pleasure. Anne was given no opportunity to appeal. Here's where the premeditation becomes undeniable. Before Anne's trial even concluded, Henry had already sent to Calais for an expert swordsman, Jean Rambaud. This wasn't the usual Tower executioner with his axe. He sold steel. This was a specialist who would use a sword for decapitation, a method virtually unknown in England, but common on the continent. The sword was considered more merciful, requiring greater skill, but producing a cleaner death. Henry was controlling every detail of Anne's death before she'd even been convicted. On May 17th, the night before her scheduled execution, Anne's marriage to Henry was formally annulled by Archbishop Cranmer. The logic was perverse. She was being executed for adultery within a marriage that was simultaneously declared never to have existed. The contradiction was obvious, but legally irrelevant. The annulment bastardized Princess Elizabeth and cleared the legal path for Henry's marriage to Jane Seymour. That night, Anne requested the Blessed Sacrament. In the presence of her chaplain, she swore on the consecrated host that she had never been unfaithful to the king. For a devout Catholic, or even for someone with reformed religious views like Anne, this was the most sacred oath possible. To swear falsely on the communion wafer was to damn one's immortal soul. This oath carries significant weight for historians assessing her guilt. The execution was scheduled for 9 a.m. on May 18th. Anne prepared herself carefully. Then came a delay. The swordsman from Calais had not yet arrived. The execution was postponed to noon, then to the following day. Anne waited, uncertainty prolonging her psychological torment. On the morning of May 19th, Anne dressed in a dark gray damask gown with a crimson kirtle underneath, red to conceal blood. She wore an English gable hood rather than the French hoods she'd popularized at court. Around her neck, she wore a pearl choker. She heard Mass one final time and maintained remarkable composure. The execution was conducted within the Tower walls on the Green, not at the public execution site of Tower Hill. Only about 1,000 selected witnesses were present. This was presented as mercy, sparing Anne public humiliation. In reality, it allowed Henry to control who witnessed the event and what narrative emerged. Anne walked from her apartments to the scaffold, accompanied by 4 young ladies in waiting. The scaffold stood only 2 feet high, draped in black cloth. Among the witnesses were Thomas Cromwell, the Duke of Suffolk, and other nobles with interest in seeing Anne eliminated. Anne climbed the scaffold and addressed the crowd. Her speech reveals extraordinary political calculation under extreme duress. She could not protest her innocence too strongly without endangering her daughter Elizabeth. She could not confess to crimes she didn't commit, so she navigated carefully. Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that, whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord. And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best. And thus I take my leave of the world and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul. Well, say. Notice what she didn't say. She didn't confess. She didn't specify her crimes. She didn't proclaim innocence. She praised Henry to protect Elizabeth while saying nothing that could be used against her remaining family. After her speech, her ladies removed her headdress and necklace, exposing her neck. They tied a blindfold over her eyes. Unlike execution by axe, where the condemned knelt with their head on a block, execution by sword required kneeling upright. Anne knelt on the scaffold, blindfolded, unable to see when death would come. She began to pray aloud. To Jesus Christ, I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul. She repeated this prayer continuously. The swordsman employed a technique designed to minimize suffering, but which added to psychological torture. He wore soft shoes or went barefoot, so Anne continued. He instructed an assistant to call out for the sword as a distraction. When Anne instinctively turned her head toward the sound, the swordsman struck from behind. The blow was professionally executed. The sword severed Anne's neck cleanly in a single stroke. Multiple eyewitnesses recorded that her lips continued moving in prayer for several seconds after decapitation. This is medically consistent with contemporary understanding of consciousness after decapitation. The brain can remain aware for several seconds until oxygen depletion causes death. The executioner held up Anne's head by the hair. To show the crowd, her ladies then gathered the head and body. No coffin had been prepared. They found an elm arrow chest and placed Anne's remains inside. She was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower, in an unmarked grave, in unconsecrated ground alongside other executed traitors. No funeral was held. The historical evidence overwhelmingly supports Anne's innocence. The imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, who had been a staunch supporter of Catherine of Aragon and no friend to Anne, wrote that many believed the charges were fabricated. The French ambassador, reported widespread doubt about her guilt. The Spanish Chronicle, written later, explicitly stated that Cromwell invented the plot because Anne opposed his foreign policy. The speed of events reveals desperation to complete the execution before opposition could organize. From Anne's arrest on May 2nd to her execution on May 19th was just 17 days. This included arrests, interrogations, 2 trials, and 5 executions. The rushed timeline suggests Henry and Cromwell feared scrutiny. Henry's behavior immediately after Anne's death was telling. On May 19th, the day of her execution, he dressed in white and went out celebrating on the Thames with musicians. On May 20th, he and Jane Seymour were formally betrothed. On May 30th, just 11 days after Anne's execution, they married. The indecent haste shocked contemporaries and suggests Henry felt no guilt whatsoever. The destruction extended beyond Anne. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was stripped of most offices and died 2 years later. Her mother, Elizabeth, died in 1538. The entire Boleyn faction at court collapsed. Princess Elizabeth was declared illegitimate and removed from succession. At 2 years old, she lost her mother, her status, and her security. The men executed with Anne left widows and children who suffered economic and social ruin. Mark Smeaton's family disappeared from historical record. Henry Norris left a son who would later serve Elizabeth I. William Brayton and Francis Weston left young families who lost lands and income. George Boleyn's execution eliminated the male Boleyn heir. Thomas Cromwell himself would be executed just 4 years later in 1540. Arrested on charges of treason and executed without trial. Henry reportedly expressed regret afterward. Too late to matter. Jane Seymour did produce the desired male heir. On October 12, 1537, she gave birth to Prince Edward. She died 12 days later from puerperal fever, a common consequence of childbirth in that era. Henry mourned her as his friend, true wife. But this sentiment came easily since she died before disappointing him. The long-term consequences were profound. Prince Edward became King Edward VI, but died at 15. Mary I, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, reigned 5 years. Then came Elizabeth I, Anne's bastardized daughter, who would rule for 45 years and transform England into a major European power. Elizabeth never publicly defended her mother. Political survival required her to avoid questioning her father's judgment, but evidence suggests Anne remained constantly in her thoughts. After Elizabeth's death in 1603, courtiers discovered a ring on her finger that opened to reveal miniature portraits of Elizabeth and Anne face to face. Elizabeth had carried this secret memorial her entire adult life. In 1876, during renovations of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, workers discovered skeletal remains consistent with Anne Boleyn's. The bones were examined and reburied in the same location. A marble floor now marks the spot, with Anne's name finally memorialized. The true horror of Anne Boleyn's execution lies not merely in her death, but in the systematic nature of her destruction. Consider the layers of cruelty. First, the psychological torture. Anne was kept in uncertainty about execution timing. She heard her scaffold being constructed. She knew her brother was executed 2 days before her. She wasn't allowed to see her daughter. Her every word was monitored and reported. Second, the judicial farce. The charges were demonstrably false. The evidence was non-existent or contradictory. The verdict was T-producted. Anne was denied legal counsel and the right to call witnesses. Her uncle sat in judgment of her. Third, the speed. 17 days from arrest to execution allowed no time for investigation, no opportunity for defenders to organize, no chance for foreign powers to intervene. Fourth, the annulment. Declaring her marriage invalid while executing her for adultery within that marriage revealed the entire proceeding as political theater rather than justice. Fifth, the aftermath. No proper burial, no memorial, immediate celebration by Henry, marriage to Jane within days, bastardization of Elizabeth, destruction of the Boleyn family. This wasn't execution, it was erasure. Henry and Cromwell attempted to delete Anne Boleyn from history. to ensure she would be remembered only as a traitorous adulteress who got what she deserved. They failed. 5 centuries later, Anne Boleyn remains one of the most famous figures in English history. Her story has been told and retold in countless books, films, and television series. Historians continue debating the details of her life and death. 3 million people annually visit the Tower of London, many specifically to see where Anne died. The site of her execution on the Tower Green is marked with a memorial. The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where she's buried, is open to visitors. Anne Boleyn, whom Henry VIII tried to erase, has achieved a kind of immortality through historical memory. But this vindication comes far too late. It doesn't undo the terror she experienced in those final 17 days. It doesn't restore the years of life stolen from her. It doesn't reunite her with the daughter she never saw grow up. It doesn't grant her the justice she was denied in 1536. What really happened at Anne Boleyn's execution was the deployment of state power for personal ends. It was the corruption of justice to serve tyranny. It was the demonstration that in Tudor England, not even a crowned and anointed queen was safe from a king's whims. The case stands as historical warning about unchecked power, about what happens when legal systems become tools of oppression rather than justice. Anne Boleyn died because she was inconvenient, because she hadn't produced a male heir, because the king wanted to marry someone else. The charges were invented. The trial was theater. The execution was murder dressed in legal robes. For historians, Anne Boleyn's execution represents a crucial moment in English history. It demonstrated the extent of Henry VIII's break with traditional constraints on royal power. It showed how religious reformation could be weaponized for personal ends. It revealed the fragility of status and position in Tudor England. For the wider world, Anne's story resonates because it speaks to universal experiences of injustice, of power abused, of lives destroyed by forces beyond individual control. And after the sons of the Moslems came forward, the deaths of the deaths were built in sacrament of the death.
Her intelligence, ambition, and political skill make her a compelling historical figure. Her unjust death makes her a tragic one.
What happened to Anne Boleyn on May 19, 1936, was far worse than most people realize. It wasn't a quick execution following a fair trial. It was a carefully orchestrated destruction of a woman who threatened the king's plans. It was psychological warfare, legal corruption, and cold-blooded murder. And it remains, 500 years later, one of the most shocking abuses of royal power in English history. The evidence speaks clearly. Anne Boleyn was innocent. The charges were fabricated. The trial was unjust. Her execution was judicial murder. History has vindicated her. But vindication cannot restore what was taken. Anne Boleyn died terrified, knowing she was innocent, unable to save herself despite her intelligence and status. That is what really happened at Anne Boleyn's execution, and it was far worse than you thought.